There is a cognitive bias so well documented that the researchers who study it use it in the first lecture of every behavioral economics course. It's called anchoring, and its premise is simple to the point of being almost insulting. The first number you hear about something becomes the reference point against which you evaluate every number that follows. In studies, researchers have asked people to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations immediately after spinning a wheel that randomly stopped at either 10 or 65. People who saw the wheel stop at 65 gave estimates roughly 50% higher than people who saw it stop at 10. The wheel had no relationship to the answer. It was explicitly random. It didn't matter. The anchor moved the estimate anyway. This is the bias that ruins every careful plan. Not because careful people are unaware of it, but because it operates below the level where awareness provides protection. You can know about anchoring, be actively trying to avoid it, and still be pulled toward the first number that entered the room. In organizational settings, the anchoring bias shows up most reliably in two places: initial estimates and prior experience. The initial estimate for a project's timeline, budget, or risk level becomes the reference point for every subsequent revision, even when the revision is large enough that it should replace the initial estimate entirely. In prior experience, the fact that the last 20 decisions of a certain kind went well becomes an anchor for the probability that the next decision of that kind will go well, regardless of whether the current situation is structurally similar. The first number in the room does not just influence the analysis. In most organizational settings, it determines the range of numbers that feel acceptable, and every number outside that range requires active justification. That is a profound structural problem for any decision that requires honest risk assessment. The most clinically studied example of anchoring bias in organizational decision-making is not a business case. It is an engineering case. And it is the reason NASA's safety culture was redesigned from the ground up following two catastrophic failures separated by 17 years. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. The cause was the failure of O-ring seals in the right solid rocket booster, which had become rigid in cold temperatures. The O-ring failure allowed hot gases to escape, leading to structural failure. The night before the launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the manufacturer of the solid rocket boosters, had raised concerns about the O-ring's performance at low temperatures. The launch temperature on January 28 was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly lower than any previous launch. The engineers' data showed a clear correlation. O-ring damage had occurred more frequently at lower temperatures in previous flights. They recommended postponing the launch. NASA management pushed back. The specific mechanism of the pushback is the anchoring story. NASA managers asked the engineers to prove that the O-rings would fail at 28 degrees. This inverted the burden of proof. The normal engineering question is, can we prove it is safe to launch? The question NASA asked was, can you prove it will fail? The anchor was the launch schedule. The analysis was reshaped to fit the anchor. The engineers could not prove failure would occur at a temperature outside any previous test range. The launch proceeded. 7 crew members died. Have you ever been in a room where the burden of proof was inverted? Where the default was the outcome the schedule required, and the challenge was to prove failure rather than to prove safety? Leave a comment. 17 years later, on February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. The cause was damage to the thermal protection tiles on the leading edge of the left wing, caused by a piece of foam insulation that had broken off during launch. Foam shedding had been observed on previous flights. Engineers at NASA had flagged it as a concern multiple times in the years before Columbia. The problem had been classified, internally, as an accepted risk, which meant, in practice, that it had been acknowledged as existing and then deprioritized, because no previous foam shedding event had caused catastrophic failure. The prior flights without catastrophic failure were the anchor. Each successful flight following a foam shedding event made the anchor stronger. The engineers who had flagged the risk were correct. The risk was real. The anchor 17 previous foam shedding events without catastrophic failure made the risk feel acceptable. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's report, released after the accident, identified the organizational culture at NASA as a contributing factor as significant as the technical failure. The report described a culture in which prior success had become a substitute for ongoing risk assessment, in which the absence of previous failure was being used as evidence that the risk was manageable, rather than as evidence that the risk had not yet expressed itself. If this kind of forensic analysis of how organizational cultures produce failures they could have prevented is the reason you're here, the like is the direct signal. The anchoring bias, in both cases, operated not as a single bad decision, but as a structural feature of how information was processed within an organization that had been successful enough to develop confident defaults. The anchor operates in business settings with the same structural logic, and with consequences that are rarely as immediate or as visible as two NASA disasters, which is partly why it's harder to diagnose and harder to fix. A startup's first investor sets the valuation anchor for subsequent funding rounds, regardless of whether the company's metrics have changed in ways that would suggest a different valuation. The first number becomes the reference point. Subsequent investors anchor to it. The due diligence process in later rounds is shaped, often unconsciously, by whether the valuation is moving in the direction the anchor implies it should move. A company's first market entry budget sets the anchor for every subsequent market entry. The second market is evaluated relative to the cost of the first, not on its own merits. If the first market cost $2 million to enter, a proposal to enter a new market at $5 million will be evaluated as expensive, regardless of whether $5 million is actually the correct cost for that market. A leadership team's prior year forecast, however accurate or inaccurate, turned out to be anchors the next year's planning process. The question that gets asked is not, what does a first principles analysis suggest? It is, how much should we adjust from last year's number? The adjustment is almost always smaller than an unanchored analysis would produce. The pattern is consistent. The first number, the prior experience, the existing expectation all function as anchors that constrain the range of conclusions that the subsequent analysis can reach, regardless of what the new information actually says. The practical intervention against anchoring is structural rather than personal, which is consistent with the general finding that cognitive biases require system-level responses rather than individual-level awareness. The most effective organizational intervention is generating independent estimates before any discussion of prior estimates, benchmarks, or expectations. Teams that are asked to produce their analysis before being exposed to any existing number, before seeing the prior year's budget, the initial project estimate, or any figure from comparable situations consistently produce estimates that are more accurate and more varied than teams that receive the anchor first. The variation is the point. When multiple independent estimates are generated and then compared, the variation reveals the genuine uncertainty in the situation. When estimates are generated after exposure to an anchor, the variation compresses. Everyone moves toward the anchor, which makes the analysis appear more certain than it actually is. A second intervention is explicitly asking, at the moment any initial estimate or benchmark is introduced to a discussion, if we had never heard this number, what range would we have generated independently? The question doesn't eliminate the anchor, but it forces the room to acknowledge its influence, which reduces not eliminates the gap between the anchored estimate and the unanchored one. The NASA case adds a third intervention, explicitly inverting the burden of proof. The question is not, can you prove it will fail? The question is always, can you prove it is safe? The difference between those two questions determines which information is treated as decisive and which is treated as requiring justification. Most organizations, when under schedule pressure, have already answered the first question before the second is asked. The next episode looks at a case where all three interventions were in place, where the organization had explicit processes designed to counter anchoring and related biases, and where a specific failure mode in the process itself produced an outcome the interventions were supposed to prevent. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.